Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit. Welcome to this week's episode. I am excited to be sharing some of my thoughts and contemplations with all of you. This is for the week of April 8th, 2024. This feels like a pretty major week to me. This is one of those weeks I looked at the beginning of the year and I went, wow, okay, we are in it. And so I'm excited. I, as always, would like to remind you that this space is really one where I invite you to co-create your own knowing with me as I'm sharing my words. Feel into what is coming up for you, what's coming up in your body, what's coming up in your heart, what's coming up in your spirit, in your intuition, and to trust that what's coming up is really what you're supposed to be looking at. So, on an overall level, the coming week to me brings a zeroing in on some pretty hot themes that have been alive for us for some time, but probably has intensified throughout this eclipse season. There's a singular spotlight on what can no longer be hidden, what can no longer be obscured from ourselves and maybe even from the world around us. There's an opportunity for the coming week to be really present with this material. It may feel intense, and if so, notice what the critical inner voices are telling you. Maybe it's telling you you're not doing this right, or you're not healing fast enough, or you're not good enough. Simply notice some of these critical voices and make space for them, not to get tangled up with them, but rather to allow them to be present without it completely running our lives. Shame feels to me like a big theme for the coming week. It may be present in our lived experiences. It may be present in our bodies. And shame shows up in many different forms. It can show up as avoidance. It can show up as over-identification or as collapse. And so I'm going to go through each one of these quite briefly just to give us an anchor. Shame showing up as avoidance may feel like this is too big for me. I don't even want to look at this. You may find that external signs that something needs to be looked at or something needs to be addressed may be very, very loud despite your mental decisiveness to not look at it. Over-identification, one can think about this as ego defense, right? I like to think about over-identification as that which is really easy to see in other people and very difficult to see in ourselves. It can look like, at least for me, making everybody else wrong except for myself. Feeling really sorry for myself, feeling the need to prove myself to everybody, feeling a strong need for other people to agree with me or to validate my perspective, rather than being open and listening and slowing down my thought patterns, my mental, the speed of my mental processing, in order to be able to see and to clearly discern whether what I'm picking up on and what I'm perceiving is true to reality, right? Or is this an amplification of what I believe or I am convinced is reality? And finally, shame can also show up as collapse. You may feel cornered. You may feel like I'm useless. I can't do this. There's nothing I can do about this situation, right? And all of these experiences can be very intense. To me, the opportunity and perhaps the focus for this coming week with this kind of astrology is to come into right relationship with these feelings. There's an invitation to make space for these feelings within our bodies, within our hearts, within our emotional body, within our spirit. These feelings, these materials that we are working with can become our most powerful teachers if we allow them to be. So, before I go into the breakdown of each of the astrology aspects of the coming week, I want to share something I've been contemplating on, which is the stages of transformation. This is something that is growing out of my work with one-on-one clients, with some of my students. And this feels important to share at this point because it feels to me like this week carries a lot of transformative opportunities. So the first stage of transformation is awareness. To me, no transformation can really begin without awareness. When we become aware, when we become awakened to the pattern that is unfolding internally or externally, then we can begin the process of transforming something. The second stage is making space for the emotions, for the sensations, for the responses, including the backlash, the explosions, the implosion of our worldview, feeling lost and discombobulated. All of these feelings are valid and they are part of our human experience, right? Making space for emotions can look like processing them with someone we can trust. It can look like sharing them, maybe publicly if that's what feels right for us. Or it can look like simply sitting in a corner of a room by ourselves and allowing these responses to come up. Not denying our bodies and ourselves of the opportunity to be with these responses. What I really want to make clear there is that there's no one right way to make space for emotions, sensations, and responses, right? You don't have to engage someone in a conversation to make space for emotions. This is something I have done in my own life as someone who is mildly extroverted. I have tried talking about my emotions before I'm ready to do so with people that I trust. And often that can be a mechanism for avoidance as well, right? We need to have discernment around whether that stage of making space for our emotions, for our sensations and responses, whether that needs to be done in private or whether that needs to be done with other people. There's no one right way. You don't always have to process this in community. Sometimes it's more potent to process them by yourself. And then the third stage for me is the process of draining off, of emptying and shedding. This process is often more energetic, and for me personally, one of the ways that I know that I am in this process is perhaps I have made space for the emotions. I've talked about them with trusted processors. I've talked about my fears. I've gotten to know the shapes and the mental stories that come with these emotions and sensations. But then I come to the stage where the process needs to happen more on an unconscious or subconscious levels. Maybe I am noticing that I process this through my dreams, or perhaps I notice it being processed through my somatic responses. Maybe I get sensations that kind of come up, or I wake up with certain sensations, or I just need to let it drain off in the background, right? The process of shedding, to me, within the whole arc of transformation, is often a very unconscious process, is a very yin process, right? It happens more in a lunar way. It happens maybe more somatically rather than mentally. And so if you find yourself moving through this draining off or emptying or shedding, it may be important to remember that it doesn't have to make sense, that a lot of it may look like your body just kind of having responses without you fully consciously making space for it. And then the last stage of transformation feels to me like an emergence, something new starting to step forward, or something that you haven't been able to access for a long time coming back online. Perhaps a part of you that feels more childlike or more innocent or more loving or maybe more curious, more playful. So I'm sharing these principles of transformation because to me, having this mental framework is very helpful when I am moving through very rapid transformations, which, because we are in eclipse season, or rather we're kind of coming out of it, because we are in Mercury retrograde, we have some very powerful conjunctions in the coming week. It feels to me like these transformative experiences may happen very quickly. And so whether that's your experience or not, it may be really helpful to just have a peripheral awareness, right, of these are the different stages. Which stage am I currently moving through? All right, so on Monday, April 8th, we have a total solar eclipse in Aries, and the solar eclipse is conjoined Chiron. It is co-present with Mercury, the North Node, and Venus. When I first saw this transit, what really struck my attention was how the Sun and the Moon is very, very closely conjoining Chiron. Usually when we're looking at conjunctions, maybe we're looking at, okay, this is conjunct by 3 degrees or maybe by 5 degrees. This one is conjunct, like very, very conjunct, right? The same degrees. And so my first response was, wow, this is a very intense solar eclipse. And I think that is true. And I also think that this is one that requires us to kind of be in the passenger consciousness, right? This is one that may ask of us to surrender, may ask of us to fully witness, fully be with, in order for us to really come into right relationship with the current that is available to us. So some of the themes that come up with Chiron are abandonment and isolation that leads to a certain level of intelligence, natural intelligence and wisdom, that leads to sharing and service and teaching others, and that finally leads to the inevitability of decay and pain and endings. And then if we look at Aries, some of the themes that are associated with Aries are similar or overlapping. There are themes of individuation, of initial sparks of desire, leading us into places where others have not been. There is pioneering energy. There is straying energy. There is the energy of creating one's own path with Aries. And so when I think about Chiron and Aries, it makes me think about some of these old lyrics, right? We've heard it a million times before. Things like, what doesn't kill you make you stronger. Or only love can break your heart. I can go on. And it's also interesting to think about how this is a new moon, so you can't really see the moon in the sky. And this is an eclipse, right? And eclipses brings unpredictability, inevitability, and it's co-present with Mercury, North Node, and Venus, which makes this transit feel even spicier to me. And so, if you would like to feel into how this may be relevant for you, some of the questions that you may be asking yourself are, what transformations have you been resisting and denying yourself? What do you know must come to an end? What new cycles do you know must be initiated, must begin, even before you feel ready? What do you know you are ready to start, but perhaps you are fearful or anxious to do so? So a theme that came up as I was contemplating this solar eclipse in Aries with Chiron being very prominent is the idea of composting shame so that life can begin. I think that part of being alive is that we end up cultivating some level of shame towards our unique expressions, especially ones that don't readily fit into the frames of what it means to be an acceptable member of society. This is something that we all move through if we live in society in one shape or another, because a lot of how we live societally, the structures are built upon us aligning with the rest of society in order to create an effective and efficient society, right? And something that came up in a conversation with one of my friends, Aaron Shipley, recently, this is something that Aaron helped me understand, is that our idiosyncrasies, our divergences, are really only problematic when we don't make space for them at the table. When we design containers for our lives, for relating, with these idiosyncrasies in mind, they can become gifts, right? For example, something I have been thinking a lot about is the idea of time containers. If you are someone who really enjoys knowing and having pretty defined and maybe even strict time containers, if that is something that feels really nourishing and feels loving to you, it's always helpful perhaps to begin every hangout with a friend or every meeting with a sentence essentially declaring that the meeting is really set for 1 hour. We can say, hey, my expectation is for this meeting to run an hour. Does that feel good to you? Right? And having it be something that we communicate often can give ourselves the permission to be fully ourselves, because then the other person doesn't have to be questioning our motives or where we're coming from. And then we have a much easier and more flowing experiences with our interactions, right? And so it's really interesting considering shame as this experience internally or even sometimes externally that makes us feel that how we naturally move through the world is not okay, and that how we naturally move through the world needs to be corrected rather than given space to be able to, in our wholeness, fully contribute that which we're uniquely here to contribute. And so the idea of composting shame, to me, has a lot to do with making space for that shame so that it can transform. The transformation here is really the point. We don't have to get stuck in the thing that we're not pleased about. The key for me is to discern whether the shame is pointing us into something that's authentic or not. As an example, I think a lot about my own self-abandonment patterns. So I think this is something that a lot of us can relate to, right? There are places or relationships or instances where I readily deny my own needs and I don't communicate until relationships become too toxic for me to stay in. Unshaming my self-abandonment patterns doesn't mean that I let myself continue to be in my self-abandonment patterns, but rather the point of unshaming it is for me to make enough space, to not get stuck in what a terrible or useless person I am for self-abandoning, or trying to spend the next 50 years of my life trying to figure out what so-and-so did wrong in order for me to come out of it, right? Rather, making enough space for me looks like what Linda Howe, the Akashic teacher, often says. You can give yourself this narrative of course you did XYZ. That was the best you could do given what you know. It starts with some level of accepting. It starts with some level of giving ourselves compassion and even perhaps making space for us to understand the logic behind why we do what we did that we are ashamed about. When we give ourselves the space and the awareness to notice our own shame patterns and notice the places that we don't feel good about, we can start to shift these patterns to become something else. So for example, let's say a pattern that we don't necessarily enjoy is envy or jealousy. If we don't allow ourselves to even feel that we are envious or even feel that we are jealous towards something, it will be very hard to see what is on the other side. To me, in my own experience and the experiences of people I've talked to, often envy and jealousy points to a certain level of admiration for a certain quality that we see in the other person, that perhaps when we give ourselves the space, when we make space to see our envy and our jealousy, we get to that admiration, and from seeing how we admire this quality, we may start to see the story that we have in our own minds about how we don't have that particular quality. And when we see that story clearly from the perspective of, I was feeling envy, I was feeling jealous, and I make space for it, and I allow myself to see how I'm actually admiring this person, then that can lead us to motivation. That can lead us to an awareness of, oh, this is a skill or this is a quality that I would like to cultivate within myself. And if I give myself permission to take up that space, to have that quality as well be expressed through me in my own unique ways, then perhaps I can begin retiring envy because I don't really need it anymore. That envy is actually pointing me towards the direction of admiration and motivation that can become fuel for me to cultivate this within myself. Another example is perhaps discomfort or judgment, right? Perhaps we see someone doing something and we feel that we're judging them. And that can be a very uncomfortable experience, right? None of us like to feel like we are judgmental people. And even when we say, I don't care, I don't mind being judgmental, often there's a lot of resistance, right? And it doesn't feel like a healthy flow when we are in that space. And so often when we make space for a judgment, we can begin to see what are some of the values that I have about how I want to be, about how I want to show up in the world that needs me to affirm them, right? What are these values? Maybe I can clarify them. Maybe I can give them more space to talk to me. And perhaps that can also lead to a certain level of self-appreciation. That as we affirm our own values, we see that a lot of our actions are aligned with those values. That perhaps we have already been honoring these values, and that our judgment towards other people's actions come from the fact that we don't play the same role as these people. That in the ecosystem of life, we are here to play a different role. We occupy a different niche. And so when we allow ourselves that space, we can go and we can transform judgment into an affirmation of our own values and into appreciating the value of our presence and our work. On Wednesday, April 10th, we have Mars conjoining Saturn in Pisces. Mars and Saturn are both malefics, and at the same time, they are ruled by Jupiter in Taurus because they're in Pisces for this particular transit. And so this to me is an interesting transit because personally, I can't help but be very excited about this transit. My first response when I looked at this transit was a lot of excitement. Perhaps that's because I also have a Saturn-Mars conjunction in my chart. I don't know. But it feels to me like even though there may be hard experiences that can come out of this transit, ultimately this transit can bring a deeper level of acceptance about which dreams, which aspirations, which hopes are actually real for us. And it may also point us in the direction of how we can make decisions to move towards those dreams, aspirations, and hopes. This transit feels very creative to me. And I should also note that it happens every 2 years, and not every Mars-Saturn conjunction are going to be easeful, right? But this one specifically feels regenerative to me. Jupiter and Taurus ruling it feel very expansive, ultimately. And even if the experience is contractive, it may be leading us towards something expansive. With Mars and Saturn conjunction, there may be inherent discomfort, there may be a grinding quality to this particular transit, but there also feels to me like there's a lot of dynamism. There is realism and pragmatism in the Piscean realm of dreams and hopes, which is often just what the doctor ordered, right? An analogy that came to me as I was thinking about this transit is perhaps you've experienced in your life loving something and always wanting to be more skilled at the thing, and then finding a coach that's right for you to cultivate that quality. Perhaps you've always wanted to be able to draw, or perhaps you've always wanted to be able to play certain musical instruments or cook certain dishes. This transit to me is an invitation to take a step in the direction that gets you closer to your dreams. Something important to remember with this transit is something that Marie Forleo, or I've heard Marie Forleo talking about quite a bit, which is everything is figure-outable, right? Everything is, there's a way out and a way in to everything. You can spend a lot of your time grieving all the resources and the support that perhaps you felt like you never received, which is absolutely necessary sometimes. Or you can decide to get really clear about what you do have, the resources at your disposal, and then try to take some baby steps to move towards the things that you want. On Thursday, April 11th, we have the Sun conjoining Mercury in Aries. As you may know, Mercury is currently retrograde in Aries. This is a transit that we call a Mercury Cazimi, and it's generally a pretty positive transit. Mercury Cazimis can facilitate understanding. It can facilitate inspiration. Mercury primarily is interested in moving the plot along, and in Aries, Mercury wants to express and move towards the things that it's passionate about, right? And we also have the Sun exalted in Aries. And so there's increased energy with this transit for communicating the things that are important to us. Impatience may also be present with this transit, and it's important to remember that impatience is not altogether bad. Impatience can really move things along. Something I recently realized is when we are overly patient, we can sometimes get lost in the details. We can sometimes get lost in the sauce of all the ornamental things that are not part of the essence. And Mercury, as I mentioned earlier, is interested in kind of moving the story or the plot along, right? And so when we think about a Mercury Cazimi in Aries, even though Mercury is currently retrograde, there's a quality about this transit that has to do with moving things along, moving things into the direction that may feel more inspiring, that may feel more fiery, that may feel like it's really lighting us up, right? And so give yourself the space to notice the places where you are impatient and the places where other people are impatient, and to give the benefit of a doubt that perhaps this impatience has a certain level of intelligence. Where is this impatience or this discomfort is pointing you towards? Is there something there for you to claim? Is there something there for you to embrace? I am also contemplating the idea of flow with this particular Mercury Cazimi. Flow is such an interesting experience. Flow to me requires us to get out of our own ways. We hear a lot of discussions in the spiritual communities nowadays about slowing down. And slowing down is absolutely necessary, especially in the context of a culture that has been running on urgency and constant production and doesn't really know how to stop or when to stop. This culture that we currently live in leads us into producing a lot of things that we never really needed in the first place, right? But at the same time, if we want to truly be in flow, sometimes that looks like moving faster than our minds would like to think. To me, in order for us to truly flow, we need to move faster when we're asked to move faster and move slower when we're asked to move slower. And in order to understand what we are being asked to do, in order to understand the correct rhythm, we need to listen. And listening sometimes is a skill that can take us a while to drop into. And so feel into, for this particular Mercury Cazimi, where are you being asked to deeply listen to the current of life as it's presenting itself to you? Another advice I would give is to remember that being decisive, being quick, doesn't have to mean being rude. With this transit, we may want to move a lot quicker than other people around us or the systems around us have the capacity for. And that's okay. It doesn't mean we don't get to propel the forward momentum along, but it does mean listen. Give yourself and others the benefit of a doubt, right? Trust that collaborating and cooperating doesn't have to mean compromising to the point that you lose steam. That there is a middle path here. There's a middle path of moving things along, of giving yourself a lot of permission to be exactly who you are and to want exactly the things that you want without having to trample all over other people and other people's needs. This can sometimes be quite difficult if we have had patterns of abandoning ourselves, abandoning our needs in the past. We may feel like the only way to champion for our own needs is to be, again, really rude towards other people. But it may be helpful to remember that we don't get to our destinations alone most of the time. Most of the time, it really is the journey that we are looking for, and having great companions can really enhance our experience as we are attempting to reach the destinations. All right, I think that's it by way of contemplations. I am so grateful that you are here. I hope that this contemplation has been helpful for you. If you would like to receive a reading and work with me one-on-one, I have one more space available in April, and then I have quite a few spaces in May, and I would love to see you and work with you. So feel free to reach out if that calls to you. Let me know if you have any questions, and I wish you a beautiful week. I hope that you take good care of yourself, and I'm sending you so much love. Thank you so much.